Chapter 1. A Dare Gone Wrong. What's the matter, Deku? Bakugo said with a sneer, his voice laced with vehemence and contempt as he uttered his favorite insult toward the green-haired boy that he tormented so frequently. The explosive blonde stood front and center, his arms crossed as he glowered down at the quirkless boy before him. His entourage of friends, sycophants, really, stood behind him, mimicking his posture as best they could, as if they were hoping to capture even a fraction of the charisma and coolness that Bakugo exuded in their eyes. Don't tell me you're scared. Izuku shuddered as all eyes were on him. He had followed Kacchan with an uncanny reverence for years despite the humiliation that was reaped upon him day in and day out, but he hated being at the center of attention like this, in front of more condescending glances than usual. It usually meant Kacchan was going to degrade him worse than he normally did. It helped that they were in the middle of the woods, though. Slightly, anyway. Izuku knew that at least if he ended up crying, which he was apt to do, he wouldn't be made a spectacle of in the middle of the park or the schoolyard, which is typically where Bakugo reveled in his bullying of him. Still, Midoriya shrunk under the gaze of Bakugo and his gang of followers. He always felt so small and beneath them all, especially Bakugo, but wasn't that why he always followed after them all, followed him, in spite of everything? So long as he followed the boy who he always thought was a model case of victory and strength, couldn't he, too, a quirkless weakling, become strong as well? I'm not scared. Midoriya stammered in the face of their malicious smirking. His shaking body said otherwise, though, and Bakugo knew it. Oh. Bakugo said with a sickeningly sweet tone. Then what are you waiting for? Get to it, Deku. Bakugo stomped toward Midoriya, gripping his shoulders and whirling him around before giving his backside a rough shove. Midoriya caught himself before he could face plant into the slick, mossy ground beneath his feet, a loud creaking noise causing him to stare up with trepidation at the looming, decrepit mansion rotting forlornly before them. The abandoned mansion was the entire reason Bakugo brought him and the rest of his gang out into these woods in the first place. Midoriya glanced all over the decaying outer husk of the building. Brown and white paint particles were flaking off unceremoniously, rotted wooden planks on both the walls and the front porch looked as if they were forcibly rent and twisted off by turbulent, stormy winds. Vines, alive and dead, had victoriously covered and consumed huge swaths of the walls and roof, which also had gaping holes in it, and what windows remained looked cracked beyond repair. All the kids in the neighborhood knew it colloquially as the Haunted Mansion, and it wasn't uncommon for kids to dare other kids to go inside and creep around, much to the chagrin of parents and local authorities alike, who had deemed the building unsafe and off-limits for years, long before Bakugo and Midoriya were born, even. You want to do something fun? Izuku thought back to Bakugo's words from earlier. How about we go check out that haunted mansion before the storm hits? A chorus of oohs and ahs followed, as if Bakugo's suggestion was scandalous. Midoriya went along with it, as did everyone else, but he hadn't picked up on the snickering and the nefarious glances being cast his way as they traipsed through the darkened woods. Now the boy knew, Bakugo waited for a soon-to-be stormy day like this to goad him into exploring the haunted mansion. Alone. A sudden drop of precipitation landing on his shoulder rocked Midoriya out his thoughts. He slowly tilted his head up at the dilapidated building towering above him. He hadn't even entered yet. He was standing on the torn-up porch, hesitating directly in front of the foreboding door. Deku. Bakugo snarled, making the poor boy jump up in fright. Hurry up. Or else we'll leave you here in the storm. Bakugo said that last bit with a nasty grin, and Izuku knew better than to call his bluff. Slowly, Midoriya shuffled forward, placing his hands on the great wooden door. If Bakugo and his gang made him feel small, then this huge, rotten building made him feel microscopic. He gave a half-hearted shove, and the door gave little resistance as it creaked open, much to his surprise. He stepped in, giving a cursory look around the decayed foyer and the staircase directly in front of him before turning back to the other boys, giving them a friendly wave as newfound courage swept through his body. Bakugo's followers whispered fervently among themselves, surprised that Midoriya hadn't cowered out like they expected. Even Bakugo looked surprised for a second, but said nothing, opting to instead grit his teeth in frustration. A sudden breeze blew through the forest before Midoriya could yell anything out, causing the door to swing shut in his face, causing him to jump back and yell in fright. The slam from the door seemed to shake the entire building, eliciting a slight groan from the structure as dust rained down from the flaking ceiling. Izuku quickly shook himself free from the clinging grime. Alright, I'm in, Izuku thought. Now what? Thinking back, Bakugo had never explained what exactly he was supposed to do once he entered the mansion. He had only told him to go in. But Midoriya didn't think Bakugo would be really impressed with him if he simply left right this moment. No, he'd at least explore a bit. To say the interior of the building was dark would be an understatement. The two rooms flanking both his left and right side were completely shrouded in darkness, and the foyer had barely any light as it was. Izuku chalked it up the brewing storm outside. The pitter-patter of falling rain was more audible, spurring him toward the stairs. He certainly wasn't going to be left behind if he could help it. With careful steps, Midoriya slowly ascended the stairs to the upper foyer. Its stability was questionable at best, but it still seemed capable enough to support his weight, which he was grateful for. He stuck near the crumbling railing and inched his way toward a side room. The upper foyer extended all the way to the back of the building, stripped bare of even the most basic decor or furniture. A large circular window crisscrossed with a strange series of arcs seemed to offer a view of the woods behind the house, but the impending storm blocked view and light alike, leaving the second story even more bleak than it was bare. A clap of thunder and a blinding flash through the window startled Midoriya. He really needed to hurry, but he wanted to make sure Bakugo would be impressed with how long he had stayed inside. Not lingering any longer, Midoriya slipped into the closest side room, promising himself he would leave right after to ensure Bakugo wouldn't leave him behind. The room was more compact and square-shaped, though just as dusty as the rest of the house. The walls were lined entirely with grand bookshelves touching all the way to the ceiling, splintered and barren of whatever texts they might have been decorated with in the past. Except. Wait, what? Izuku blinked and approached a bookshelf that ended in the far corner of the room. Hiding in the shelf's shadow and coated beneath a surprisingly thin layer of dust was a single book. Midoriya's curiosity took over as he reached out to fetch it. He stared at the cover for a good minute before flipping it over and studying its backside and spine. Midoriya discovered the leather cover of the book was a brilliant shade of red beneath the minute amount of dust covering it. There were no words written on the cover, and when he flipped it open to a random page, he was greeted with lines and lines of indiscernible text. What language is this? Izuku wondered. It's not Japanese, or even Chinese for that matter. The sound of thunder struck again, this time reverberating through the shelves and causing the entire room to shake harder than the foyer had just moments prior. Without even thinking, Midoriya slammed the book shut, tucked it under his arm, and bolted out of the room and down the stairs. The pelting of rain and the howling wind that accompanied it was louder than ever, and Midoriya felt a surge of panic at the prospect of Bakugo abandoning him here to ride out the storm in the night. He'd certainly have some explaining to do to his mother the following day if that were to happen, provided she didn't die from worry first. Midoriya burst through the door and nearly yelled out in relief as he saw Bakugo standing in his exact same spot, along with his other friends behind him, though they looked more desperate than their leader to seek shelter from the storm. Bakugo's natural scowl only deepened as the quirkless loser finally emerged from the house after roughly 8 tense minutes. About damn time, shitty deku. Would you look at that, one of Bakugo's cohorts muttered as he wrapped his arms and elongated fingers around his torso, shivering in the blustery rain. Quirkless Kid went in and came out just fine. Oi! Deku! Bakugo barked. He leveled his glare directly at the poor boy, not looking or feeling impressed in the slightest. In fact, all he felt was frustration that Midoriya had succeeded. We're leaving. Without even waiting for the green-haired lad to respond, Bakugo turned and stormed off, his hands in his pockets as his followers flocked around behind him. Midoriya wasted no time in bounding across the mossy forest floor now waterlogged from the incessant rain to catch up with the rest of the group. In a few minutes' time, the group of boys found their way back along the ravine that held the creek they had played around so many times in years prior. They always followed the creek back in the general direction of the park whenever they decided to play out here, but the sight before them made the drenched youths linger in awe. The ravine before them no longer held the gentle creek they had seen an hour before, but instead contained a rampaging torrent of rapid floodwaters, filled to the brim with mud and debris, and that was just on the surface. The kid with the elongated fingers turned toward Midoriya, noticing the red spine of a book nestled in his armpit. Whoa, Midoriya even managed to sneak something out of the mansion. For the second time that day, Midoriya shrank as all eyes were on him. It didn't matter that they didn't have looks of contempt on their faces, he was simply conditioned after so many years of bullying to feel uncomfortable and brace for the worst whenever this happened. The worst, unfortunately, was about to come. Bakugo growled, pushing the boys that were crowding around Midoriya and inquiring about his find aside so he could see it for himself. Sure enough, tucked in snugly beneath the boy's arms was a thick, red book. Midoriya was shielding it as best he could from the rain, but Bakugo saw it as Midoriya trying to keep it away from him. Naturally, his anger surged. Well, Bakugo spat. I never pegged you to be a thief and a loser, Deku. Midoriya blinked as the words reverberated inside his head. Thief. And you want to be a hero. Bakugo was sporting his trademark crazed grin now. How can you even play the role of a worthless wannabe hero when you steal things like a villain? Midoriya clenched his eyes shut and backed away from the boys as Bakugo's words stung his brain like a hornet. Like a villain. Like a villain. Immense guilt swelled inside Izuku as he took another step back from the gang of boys, moving away just as Bakugo was reaching out to grab hold of the book's spine, earning him a murderous glare. Give me the book, Deku. Bakugo growled. He clenched his fists. He might not have been able to use his quirk as effectively in the rain, but he could still throw a hell of a punch. Keikachan. Midoriya yelled out in protest, taking another step backwards toward the edge of the ravine. I need to return this. What you need to do is fork that book over. Bakugo growled with even more anger. Was that even possible? Of course it was. Kachan. Whatever protests Midoriya was about to yell were lost as he felt the earth give way beneath his foot with one final step back. Gravity took full effect as his body tumbled backwards, with the last thing the quirkless boy seeing before submerging into the murky depths below was the look of absolute shock on Bakugo's face. Help. Izuku sputtered desperately as the torrential floodwaters tossed and turned him like a load of laundry. He lost his grip on the book, but he hardly even noticed as he was flailing his arms wildly trying to keep himself from sinking. He parted his lips the moment his face was met with air and not water, gasping for breath as he looked around, beleaguered and distraught about his predicament. Midoriya whimpered before being pulled back under by the raging current. There was no one to be seen running along the ravine edge. Bakugo and his followers were gone. He was going to die, and he was going to die alone. Something solid and hefty suddenly rammed into his side, knocking what little breath he had out of his lungs, but fortunately also propelling him back to the surface. Midoriya instinctively clung to the object, a log large enough for him to hold onto, as he was swept away. He kept his eyes tightly shut as rain, wind, and muddied water battered his face relentlessly. Midoriya suddenly yelled out in pain. A searing, scratching sensation ran up his right cheek where the pointed tip of an errant branch being danced around the raging waters sliced across his skin. The hapless boy only clung to his makeshift lifeboat harder, even as the waters began banging the wayward log against what Midoriya could only surmise to be other logs and whatever debris he could imagine. With his eyes clenched shut, the boy could only guess what the chaos swirling around him in the muddied waters looked like. Midoriya sputtered and sobbed as he was tossed so mercilessly down the ravine, but his sobs soon gave way to horrid, blood-curdling screams as his log rammed straight into a derelict tree trunk entrenched in the depths of the river, his hands being pinned and crushed between both splintered, wooden surfaces. In the wake of the blistering pain, Midoriya yanked his eyes wide open as he screamed out, only to be met with a splattering of muddied water to his face. The muck blinded him, and he slipped limply off his log the moment his crushed hands were released from the vice. I'm going to die. Izuku thought hopelessly. I'm going to die and I'll never become a hero. Now back to being tumbled back and forth by the unyielding waves, Midoriya could only gurgle out his screams whenever he was plunged back into the murky depths. The final thought that flashed into his mind before losing consciousness was his mother, and how heartbroken she'd be whenever his body was recovered. The splashing of a wave stirred him out of the all-consuming darkness. His eyelids cracked open, blinking repeatedly in a vain attempt to clear out the gunk that blurred his vision. Am I alive? Izuku thought weakly as he swiveled his head around, taking note of his surroundings as best he could. He was laying on his back, that much he knew. It seemed he had miraculously washed up on the bank of the ravine. Casting his gaze down toward the water, he could see it still churning ferociously, though the rain had lessened a considerable deal. With a grunt, Midoriya tried lifting his body up, but found he had no energy to do so. He tried settling for his arms instead, but winced in pain. A surge of adrenaline was felt as Midoriya realized he could not even feel his hands, let alone move them. Midoriya coughed and let his head drop back down. His body couldn't even handle that minuscule rush of adrenaline it seemed, and he could already feel his consciousness slipping away from him again. That is, until some movement above him caught his blurry eye. Who? He croaked out but felt his mouth clam up. It came as no shock that he also lacked the energy to even speak. Don't move, a gruff voice replied. Izuku released a sigh he hadn't even realized he was holding at that moment. He strained to get a good look at his savior before everything faded. The only precise details he could make out was a gentlemanly face, a blue tunic, and a flapping, red cloth that gently wrapped around his body, coating him in what felt like an otherworldly warmth. Izuku let his eyes flutter shut as he drifted peacefully to the sensation of being slowly lifted to safety. 696 Chapter 2, Crushed Hands, Crushed Dreams. Darkness and warmth were not typically things Izuku would correlate with one another, yet the waves of warmth that washed over his body, inundating him with a serene sense of calmness, had not waned in the slightest as he drifted through sleep. The gentleman, the tunic, the red cloak capturing his body in such a gentle embrace, those were the last things he saw before darkness once again robbed his senses. Well, his normal senses, anyway. Izuku could hardly explain it even as he was set adrift among the ether of his own unconsciousness, but he could still feel that cloak wrapped loosely around his drenched form and the comforting heat that seemed to literally pulse out of its fibers. And further beyond the gentle radiance of the cloak was the other sensation he had detected before his mind slipped away, that of being lifted off the sludgy riverbank by the gentleman he had caught a glimpse of. Or was it the cloak? Now that he thought about it, it had seemed like the blue-robed gentleman and the red cloak were almost like two different entities. Did that cloak belong to a second individual? Had someone else besides the gentleman slipped down into the ravine to fetch his exhausted body without Izuku even noticing them or their features? A sudden shift in sensations forced Izuku to file that thought away for the time being. The shift rippled all through the darkness he was floating in. What was happening? The feeling of being lifted had ceased, and now he was sinking. The last thing he had felt against his backside before the heat was the slick mud of the riverbank, but now his back was being pressed against what had to be a cushion of some kind. He was sinking into it, but not to the point where Izuku feared falling into it entirely. And speaking of the heat of the cloak that had undoubtedly saved him, that, too, had dissipated. Izuku despaired and imagined himself reaching out into the abyss, hoping that it was not totally beyond his grasp, but there was no vestige of heat left to be felt. And then, a stirring. And Izuku finally opened his eyes. Beep. 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 Where there was once a safe cocoon of darkness surrounding him, Izuku now found himself blinking helplessly beneath a white light, blinding, intense, and invasive. What Izuku thought as his eyes reoriented themselves, his vision no longer obstructed by the muddied muck of the river. Where am I? The glare of the light faded as his eyes became more adjusted with each blink. He was in a hospital room. The white walls, ceiling, floor, and bed were probably what made the light of the room so initially blinding. Beep. 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 Izuku tilted his head toward the sound. An EKG monitor was to the right of his bed, beeping in tandem with his pulse, causing Izuku to be grimly aware of the wires and tubes connected to his body. Thankfully, his mouth was clear. A television was mounted on the wall before him, and a few posters of doctors and health-related phrases dotted the walls here and there. It didn't make the room seem any less blindingly white, though. Ah, so you awake at last. Izuku nearly jolted at the gruff voice that spoke to his left. Wait, that voice. Izuku snapped his head in the voice's direction, eyes widening in shock at the man that sat beside him, blue tunic, red cloak draped over the hospital chair, the meticulously trimmed goatee, the combed, well-kept hair. This was without a doubt the man he had seen after washing up on the riverbank. Why you saved me? Izuku sputtered as he tried sitting up in his bed, though his body's muscles protested with great pain and a well of newfound tears threatened to spill forth. The gentleman was up in an instant, placing his palm against Izuku's chest and gently nudging him to lie back down. When his backside pressed against the cushion of his hospital bed, Izuku realized that this must have been the sensation, the soft sinking one, he felt before waking up. Yes, I did save you, young man, the stranger said after ensuring Izuku was placed back into a fully resting position. His lips became taut and his eyes took on a studious yet grim look, as if he was observing the green-haired boy but was crestfallen by what he saw. Though I'm afraid I did not save you in time. Izuku's breath got caught in his throat and the monitor beside him began beeping a bit more rapidly. Beep beep. Beep beep. Beep beep. What do you mean? Izuku managed to rasp out before descending into a harsh coughing fit, turning his head away from the man who had saved him. When Izuku turned back, the strange man had a piping hot cup in his palm before him. The vapors wafted across Izuku's face, tickling his nostrils before he took the hint and parted his lips for the steaming liquid that the man was offering him. Izuku couldn't decide which was worse, the burning heat of the drink or its goddamn saltiness. Much to his relief, however, the man only offered a sip out of the diminutive cup before pulling it away. His taut lips loosened into something akin to a forlorn smile as Izuku struggled to keep himself from spitting the salty concoction all over his clean, white hospital sheets. Butter tea, the man said as he set the cup down on a small table nestled in between Izuku's bed and the chair he was sitting in. The table, Izuku noted, had a sizable stack of what could only be get-well cards and a second teacup, filled with the same brew he had just been subjected to. The heat and the salt combined will help keep your throat clear of mucus. I won't give you too much. No need for you to fall ill to dehydration when you've already almost drowned. Midoriya blinked and nodded his head numbly before turning his attention toward the stack of cards resting beside the butter tea. The gentleman followed his gaze to the cards and seemed more than willing to push their conversation along. Ah, yes, you've received quite a few of these, the man said, picking up a pink-colored one and holding it open in front of Izuku's face for him to read, much to the boy's confusion, though he said nothing as he perused the card. It was very monotonous and bland, with a generic, "Get well soon," scribbled in the middle of the card with a nearly incomprehensible name signed on the bottom. Izuku recognized it as a student from his class, though why they would send him a get-well card was beyond him. No one even gave him a passing glance besides Bakugo and his ilk. Izuku shuddered and felt his gut sink in as if it had been punched at the mere thought of Bakugo. Memories of his recent ordeal began flashing through his mind, and the most terrifying realization that had come to Izuku when he was being battered by waves and logs alike was not just that he believed he was going to die, he truly thought he was going to die alone, abandoned by the boy he had so reverentially followed for so long. The man flipped through card after card for Izuku to look through. All of them were the same: bland, repetitive colors, generic wording, lazily written signatures. Izuku was sure by this point that the cards weren't made willingly, that they'd been crafted by the order of his homeroom teacher. Adding further insult to injury was the fact that in that whole stack, there was not a single card from Bakugo. Izuku visibly winced. Maybe Bakugo really had left him for dead. Maybe he really didn't care if Deku had died. "I'm grateful for what you've done for me, sir," Izuku said, a feeling of exhaustion swirling in his stomach. "But you don't have to feed me tea or hold the cards up for me." Izuku tried raising his arms to push the empty gesture that was his classmate's card away from him. And then he froze. My hands." Izuku had a terrified expression etched on his face as he gaped at his thickly bandaged hands resting atop the covers. How had he not noticed this earlier? Was he still that exhausted? Izuku grunted as he tried flexing his hands beneath the layers of gauze covering them, but it was no use. He felt pain as he tried lifting his arms, but his hands. He had hardly any feeling in either of them. He shakily turned his head back toward his savior, his wide eyes seeking desperately for an explanation. But the grim, taut face returned to the blue-robed gentleman as he sat back down and stared at the boy's ruined hands dismally. There was a glint of empathy in the man's eyes, as if he understood Izuku's predicament all too well. "I'm afraid I did not save you in time." The words rang clearly in the boy's head as the realization dawned on Izuku that this must have been what the gentleman was referring to. His hands. They were beyond any hope of repair. "Young man." All he got in response was a whimper from the boy. The gentleman grimaced, furrowing his admittedly stern-looking brow as a series of shakes and hiccups overtook the child in question, gazing disconsolately upon his broken hands. "Izuku." A high-pitched cry reverberated through the room, snapping the two of them out of whatever musings they were stuck in as a homely-looking woman barged through the door and flung herself at the bedridden boy, sobbing uncontrollably. The boy's mother, no doubt, the man thought as he looked on, watching the boy resting limply in his mother's grasp, his eyes looking more and more drained by the second. After a few racking moments of indecipherable mutterings of concern mixed with a questionably unhealthy amount of sobs, the woman, Inko, he believed her name was, based on past visits, finally pulled herself away from her son, who simply laid back lifelessly into his bed without uttering a word toward his mother. "You've been out for 2 whole days, Izuku." Inko cried while wiping away the continuous wave of tears spilling down her cheeks. "When I got a call from the doctor that you were beginning to stir, I came right over." 2 whole days. Izuku thought blankly as he processed that information. That would certainly explain the cards from his classmates. 2 days would have been more than enough time to hastily put 20 or so cards together and mail them to the hospital. "And who might you be?" Inko said, sniffling as she turned her attention toward the man in the blue tunic. The man blinked in surprise before swiftly standing up to give her a courteous bow. "My apologies, where are my manners? I've kept watch over the boy, and I've yet to formally introduce myself. My name is Stephen Strange," the man, Strange, said. "Dr. Stephen Strange. A doctor?" Inko asked with a small smile, feeling slightly more at ease by the display of politeness from Strange. "Are you one of the doctors that worked on my son in the emergency room?" "Alas, no," Strange said with a tone of resignation. "I am merely the man who retrieved your son out of the ravine and, oof." Inko had blindsided Strange with a tackling hug, throwing her arms around him as she buried her face into his tunic. He could both feel and hear the waterworks of her tears kicking into action once more. Right after she had gotten them under control, too. "Thank you," she sobbed. "I will never be able to repay you for saving my boy." Strange struggled to keep himself from collapsing under the crushing weight of Inko's hug, but he still managed to work her way back down, or up, from her inconsolable display of grief. Strange gave his tunic a few brushes with his hand after she had calmed down, and tried his hardest to conceal his small grin of amusement to the fact that his garb now sported a noticeable tear stain on it after being subjected to the woman's tear ducts for no more than a minute. I assure you, there's no need to thank me, ma'am, Strange replied graciously. I'll not hear you selling your own actions short. Inko replied sternly. You saved Izuku's life. If you hadn't been there. Izuku merely laid in his bed as his mother reaped her accolades on Strange's shoulders, who in turn shrugged them off as humbly as he could. He wasn't listening to their conversation. All of his attention was focused squarely on his hands. His rent, broken, bandaged, lifeless hands. Izuku had always been called weak and powerless throughout his childhood by others. It had been expected he was quirkless, after all. But even though he had suffered through numerous instances of bullying and beatings and taunts over the years, mostly from Kachan, Izuku had never truly felt powerless until the moment he laid eyes on his shattered extremities. So the worthless Deku wants to be a hero, huh? Izuku tried curling his fingers once more, and dismayed when he could not. Give up on that shitty dream of yours, you quirkless loser. He clenched his eyes shut. He didn't want to shed tears uncontrollably like his mother had just moments prior. How could he become a hero without his hands? How could he help people, save people, like All Might if he couldn't use his hands to lift people up, to hoist and carry people to safety, to punch villains into the dirt? He was sure Bakugo would one day become one of the greatest heroes of all time, and even he depended on the use of his hands for his quirk. And his doctor said that within another day or two, the bandages can come off permanently. Izuku perked up as Strange was most definitely talking about his hands. Oh, thank goodness. Inko sighed, clasping her hands together. I'll be sure to take him straight home once he's been cleared. And then what? Izuku weakly muttered, causing both adults to turn towards him with startled expressions. Izuku. Inko whispered worriedly. And then what? Izuku repeated, staring up at them with despondently heartrending eyes. Look at my hands. I can't become a hero after this, Mom. A dumbstruck Strange glanced back over to Inko, only to catch her before she could collapse to the ground. Her facial expression looked as if something inside her had visibly cracked and shattered. How can I help people if I can't use my hands? Izuku wailed, the tears he had tried so desperately to keep bottled up finally pouring down his cheeks, the monitor beside him beeping dangerously fast. 696 Chapter 3, Teach Me. Strange had barely settled Inko's slumped form down in the chair beside the bed before the door to the hospital room burst open, a small cadre of nurses rushing in to cease the boys' wailing and thrashing, trying their damnedest to get Izuku to compose himself. The boy, to his credit, did not put up much resistance as the nurses successfully restrained him, administering medicine to forcibly calm his obviously frayed nerves as well as checking and documenting all of his vitals. Turning his attention back to Inko, Strange tilted her body back so her head rested against the wall behind her, ensuring she would not slide out of her spot and collapse to the tile floor. Confident the woman was safe where she sat, Strange turned again toward Izuku to monitor over the nurses giving him aid. He fully intended on jumping into the fray himself and administer orders to the cluster of nurses working diligently over the now silent child, against his better judgment, though he could recall medical knowledge just as readily as any spell from the Book of Bashanti, and it was not difficult for him to regress to his younger inclinations of being overwhelmingly authoritative given the hospital setting. It's under control, a dull-sounding voice said as a hand suddenly shot out in front of Strange before he could take another step toward the bed. A rather bedraggled-looking man was standing beside the sorcerer. He wore the garb of a doctor, though Strange would have been hard-pressed to acknowledge him as such on first impressions alone given the man's grizzled gray hair, loosely fit clothing, and slouchy posture. The man finally turned to face Strange, bright green eyes slowly dissipating back into a lusterless shade of hazel. X-ray eyes, the doctor explained with an enthusiastic sigh. My quirk lets me scan through organic matter and pick up on any medical anomalies. He raised his hand over his shoulder and lazily bobbed his thumb over in Izuku's direction. He checks out. Just a panic attack. Another sigh. X-ray vision, Strange couldn't deny that such a quirk offered priceless utility in a medical profession. But to held by such an enthusiastic fellow. Tushi, the doctor said. I beg your pardon. Strange replied, snapped out of his musings. My name, the man, Tushi, explained and limply offered his hand. Dr. Tushi. Strange, the sorcerer said, gripping Tushi's hand only for it to drop back down lifelessly after what had to have been the worst handshake of Strange's life. Doctor. Strange. Tushi perked an eyebrow. I figured as much. You were here 2 days ago, when this boy was brought in. You were giving your recommendations to the other doctors. There was a sarcastic emphasis put around that word, recommendations. That would be the polite way of putting it. Strange thought back to when the doctors were rushing Izuku into the Strange was spouting orders to the men and women around him, who looked at him dumbfounded but carried out his demands without resistance. It must have been a strange sight indeed, to both doctor and patient alike, to see a man in a blue tunic and a red cloak shouting out precise medical jargon and procedures to everyone around him. Strange knew if Wong was there he'd have told him to be at least a little sheepish about his behavior that day, but Strange, stubborn man that he is, couldn't bring himself to regret his abrasive actions. In that instant, watching that young man suffering from wounds so startlingly similar to those inflicted on him many years ago, Strange felt himself the Surgeon Supreme, again instead of the Sorcerer Supreme. Still, it was admirable, Tushi drawled on. You know your stuff. You sure you want to continue being a pro-hero and not take over my job here? Oh, no, you're mistaken, sir, Strange said after a few moments were taken contemplating Tushi's statement. I am not a pro-hero. Oh. Tushi's face morphed into one of confusion, a step up from his typical lukewarm expression. Strange noted. I had thought you were, considering. Strange saw Tushi's gaze drop down to his admittedly unusual attire, understanding where the confusion was stemming from in an instant. It's complicated, was all that Strange found himself willing to offer his fellow doctor. Right. Tushi said with a tone of apprehension before pointing over at Inko's wilted body resting in the corner of the room. And what about her? The boy's mother merely passed out after his fit, Strange explained. She should be fine after some rest, but if you'd like to formally examine her. No thanks, Tushi quickly waved the suggestion away. Less work for me to do. A tap suddenly came against Tushi's shoulder from one of the nurses, indicating that they had finished their work. She handed him a clipboard which he perused with thinly veiled disinterest. Well, that's that. Stabilized and analyzed, Tushi said, handing the clipboard back before speaking to Strange again. Feel free to stay if you wish. Just don't overstay. I don't have to tell you the importance of rest for a patient in his condition. Tushi lazily swiveled toward the door, shooting Izuku a glance as he pushed it open. TCH, importance of rest, Tushi muttered before finally departing for his next chore. I wish I could just lie in bed all day. The nurses bowed before Strange one by one before exiting the room in the same manner. Strange, chivalrous as always, returned the courtesy to them. Languid lout, Strange muttered under his breath as the last nurse departed, silently thankful that Tushi was not one of the surgeons who had operated on Izuku's hands. Strange was back to Izuku's side, watching the boy now resting peacefully in his bed, a far cry from the thrashing, sobbing mess he was just a few minutes ago. His eyes lingered on his tear-stained freckles before sliding his gaze down to his bandaged hands. A painful pang of remembrance jolted through Strange's mind. In that instant he saw not Izuku lying in the hospital bed, but himself, despairing over the ruined state of his hands. And the ruined state of what was once his prestigious surgical career. I could have done better. Strange thought of that pathetically bitter whimper he had uttered when perusing the work done to save his own hands, work that Strange had, at the time, been convinced was botched and amateurish. Strange shook his head clear of such distasteful memories. He would not pedantically comb over every inch of skin that Izuku's surgeons had worked on. He would simply have faith that the surgeons had done the absolute best they could. Have faith, Strange said quietly to himself, chuckling at the irony of that statement. Where would he be today if he hadn't lacked faith in the aftermath of his operation? His lack of faith helped set him off on a grand naive adventure to right the wrongs of his grievous injuries. Lacking faith is what ultimately led him to Kamartaj in his most desperate bid for treatment. Lacking faith is what set him on the path to becoming Sorcerer Supreme. Strange felt a twinge of movement and saw one of the bottom tips of his cloak of levitation curl up toward Izuku's face, gently wiping away what tears remained on his cheeks. "You've taken a liking to him, haven't you?" Strange asked unabashedly. The enchanted cloak bristled with confirmation before settling back into place lifelessly upon Strange's backside. Strange couldn't help but chuckle again. "As have I." Strange connected the tips of his middle and index fingers at an angle, curling his thumbs into his palms. The tips of his connected fingers sparked with a radiant orange energy before he briskly drew them apart, downwards, and then together again, drawing a large square shape in the air with his fingertips. When his fingers reconnected, Strange's magic rushed inward, filling out the empty space of the diagram with energy. There was a bright flash, and a blanket had materialized where the mystical square had once been. Plucking the fluttering fabric out of the air, Strange set it loose over Inko's sleeping body, letting it settle nicely on top of her. She, being the boy's mother, deserved some comfort in all of this, too. Strange then raised his hands, stretching his left one out and curling the fingers of his right, circulating them up and down as his magical energy swirled before him like a vortex. The space then split apart, opening wide to reveal his sleeping quarters in the depths of his sanctum. His portal opened, and Strange prepared to step through and retire for the day when suddenly, "How can I help people if I can't use my hands?" Izuku's declaration of despair rang through Strange's head, the words giving him pause as he placed one foot through the portal. Those words. Despite what similarities Strange had noted between Izuku and himself, those words highlighted a great difference between the two. Izuku possessed a far more impressively selfless nature than Strange could have hoped to have had when he suffered his injury. Where he had been distraught over the loss of his hands, Strange knew now, and could admit without shame, that what truly destroyed him that day was what that loss represented. His lucrative and wealthy career, built up meticulously over many years of dedicated study and practice, lain to waste in a single day. It was easy for Strange to see and understand the loss that Izuku surely perceived when he gazed down in abject horror at his own broken hands. He had lost the simplest, kindest way to offer help to another person. Where the Stephen Strange of the past had viewed his own two hands as little more than tools for maintaining the aggrandizement of arguably the world's greatest surgeon at the time, Izuku viewed his own two hands as the simplest, yet best, way to offer any aid he could spare to others. Strange understood this clearly. And now he understood what he had to do. "Izuku Midoriya," he whispered to himself as he stepped fully through his portal. "I failed to rescue you in time, but I refuse to simply stand aside and allow such a pure dream to perish where you lie." Giving the boy one last glance, Strange flicked his fingers in the direction of his sleeping quarters. The two teacups he had placed on the hospital desk suddenly levitated, propelled by his unseen magical energy, and darted through the portal right as it closed. "I will give you pity no longer, Izuku," Strange thought as his eyes slowly adjusted from the bright white of the hospital to the darkness of his sanctum. "I will instead offer you what my master offered me all those years ago." He allowed the cloak of levitation to remove itself from his back. Strange wasted no time in retiring for bed to get plenty of rest for tomorrow. A path to follow. Izuku wished he'd gotten plenty of rest for today. When he groggily regained his senses after being restrained by the nurses, nighttime had already arrived. His mother, couched in the same chair as the gentleman that had saved him, greeted him with familiar teary eyes. She looked significantly worn out, though Izuku was lacking a mirror right in that moment and couldn't imagine himself looking that much better. "Sweetie," Inko said tiredly. "A nurse came by earlier, but you were still out. Would you like some dinner? I know hospital food can leave much to be desired, but it might not be a bad idea to at least get some food in you." Izuku visibly tensed and jerked his head away, resting his gaze squarely on his still bandaged hands. No, Izuku thought. They've been replaced with clean bandages. Did it happen while he was rendered unconscious by the nurses? It didn't really matter, he'd supposed. He was just grateful to not be awake when they did it. I'm not hungry, Izuku grumbled, turning his face away from his mother's. Inko reached out, her lip quivering as if to say something in protest, but whatever was bubbling just beneath the surface managed to stay there. Inko didn't argue or press the matter any further. They sat in silence, with the sole exception being the beeping from Izuku's EKG monitor, for what felt like an hour. A sound of stirring caught Izuku's attention, forcing him to face his mother again, only to see her standing up and stretching her arms. How long had she sat there watching over me? How long had the gentleman? It's getting late, Inko said, leaning down to plant a motherly kiss on Izuku's forehead while she glided a hand through the curly green sea of his hair. Dr. Tushi said I can take you home tomorrow so long as you don't have another. She bit her lip, struggling to finish her sentence. Breakdown, Izuku dejectedly thought for her. Unsurprisingly, Inko left her sentence hanging in the air. She creaked the door open slowly, almost as if she was trying to open it as slowly as possible, as she gave her son one final forlorn smile for the night. Then she proceeded to close the door at an agonizingly slow pace, as well. The door finally clicked shut. It took another minute before the sound of his mother's footsteps faded down the hall. And Izuku was finally alone. Beep. 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 Not quite alone, he guessed. Midoriya, Dr. Tushi said sluggishly as he sauntered into the room with a nurse without even looking at his patient. His eyes were glued to whatever data or information was on his clipboard, though he looked at it with equal indifference. I hope you've slept well. Izuku cracked his eyes open in Tushi's direction, hoping the bags beneath his eyelids would speak for themselves. When Tushi finally looked up at him as if he was actually expecting a verbally given answer, Izuku responded, I slept well. The time on the clock was now 9 a.m. Izuku had stayed up for 12 hours straight, fidgeting the night away in his bed. Oh sure, he'd tried to catch some sleep last night, but sleep was not just elusive, it was non-existent. How was he supposed to get any decent sleep with that damn monitor beeping all goddamn night? Oh, cripes, Izuku thought. I'm starting to think like Kachan now. Good, Tushi's voice dripped with apathy. Well, everything seems to be in order, so let's not waste any more time, shall we? I do enough of that clocking in every day. The nurse, a far younger-looking woman with long, blazing red hair, bounded forward after that, practically skipping toward Izuku's bedside with a saccharine grin plastered across her face from ear to ear. Morning, Izuchin. The nurse said, quickly disconnecting the monitor and shutting it off before leaning down closer to Izuku, who had a blanched look smeared on his own face. I'm Nurse Kuchi, and I'm going to help take your bandages off. Would you like that? Dr. Tushi, help me. Izuku screamed in the deep recesses of his own head. Before he could stammer out a protest of any sort, Kuchi puckered her lips and planted a sloppy kiss directly onto Izuku's forehead. What the? Followed by a tingling sensation consuming his whole body that Izuku could have sworn was just a natural reaction. How's my quirk feel? Kuchi giggled. My quirk is called numb, people lose all sensation in their bodies for a few minutes whenever I kiss them. For a second I thought I was just. This way you won't feel any pain when I take your bandages off. Kuchi interrupted his thoughts. Not that you should feel any pain, but one can never be too careful. Let's get this over with, Tushi sighed. Layer by layer, the doctor and nurse unraveled the long strips of bandages covering Izuku's hands. The shock and embarrassment from Kuchi's kiss helped to distract him from the slow, gentle procedure. All done, Tushi said dully. Any lingering embarrassment Izuku held over Kuchi's kiss was swiftly swept away by a visceral wave of shame and remorse. Tushi, to his credit, said nothing and looked back at his clipboard, though Izuku couldn't decide whether it was for lack of caring or if he didn't want to seem rude by staring, while Kuchi offered him a sympathetic smile. Hang in there, Izuchin, Kuchi said, kissing her fingertips before tapping them against his forehead. A simple way to show affection while getting around an obvious drawback of her quirk, Izuku noted. Guess we're done here, Tushi said, tucking the clipboard into his armpit. Your mother already called ahead, she's coming to check you out. Once she's here and you change out of your hospital clothes, you'll be free to go. Izuku said nothing, but nodded to show that he understood. Tushi grunted and left without another word, Kuchi following right behind him, but making sure to blow Izuku another kiss before she, too, left. Izuku wanted to say it helped somewhat. But that would have been a filthy lie. Alone once more, Izuku stared at the only thing he wished he could bring himself to not, his superfluous hands, scarred far worse than he imagined they would be. They looked absolutely gnarled. Izuku ran his hands over each other, delicately touching the indentations of the scars on both his palms and on the back of his hands even though Kuchi's quirk hadn't worn off yet. Even the squiggles of his knuckles seemed indistinguishable from the rest of the scars. Oh. Izuku blinked as the numbing sensation suddenly began to fade away, first from his forehead, then spreading down across his body. And then reaching his arms. Izuku audibly gasped as feeling crept back into his hands and digits like a hand fitting snugly into a glove for the first time in months. He hadn't possessed any sense of feeling in his hands yesterday, and already he could bend his fingertips and feel the movements. He gingerly ran his hands back over each other again. Maybe this wasn't a complete disaster, he told himself. Maybe I can still use my hands after all. He felt relieved. Maybe I really can still become a... And then the shaking started. At first Izuku was confused. He could still bend his fingers and move his hands, he could still feel all of that, so then why? No, Izuku quietly whimpered as he sat there, watching helplessly as his hands shook and trembled uncontrollably. No. No, no, oh no. Because that was the real source of his problem now, wasn't it? Sensation returned to his hands, just as he'd hoped, but fate decided to hoard away that which he desperately needed most of all, control. A scarred hand he could lift. A scarred hand he could flex. A scarred hand he could use. But a scarred hand, trembling uncontrollably, unable to even properly grasp and lift up the edge of the bed sheet he was lying on. Izuku bit his lip and choked back a sob as he laid his unsteady hands down on the bed sheet. He couldn't bear to lay them directly on his thighs and feel the shakes throughout his whole body. The world seemed determined to strip Izuku of any means possible to become a hero. First, fate robbed him of a quirk. Then it took his hands. What could be next? A cruel reminder of his debilitating condition immediately after he'd discovered it, apparently. Kuchi swept back into the room with an elongated tray of food, placing it before Izuku by clasping its bottom onto the handlebars on the side of his bed, a simple yet nifty method to give patients mostly relegated to their beds a way to eat food that didn't require getting up or leaning over to a side table. Sausages, a rice bowl, orange slices, a carton of milk, it all looked appetizing, well, as appetizing as hospital food could be, anyway. Except he couldn't stand to even look at the food, let alone eat any of it. I didn't order any breakfast, Izuku muttered. You didn't, Kuchi said softly, her once bubbly personality now somber as she looked over Izuku's trembling hands. He wished she wouldn't look at him with such pity. Your mother's down in the lobby, Kuchi continued. She'll be up shortly to help you with this. She demanded that you put some food in you before leaving. And with that, Kuchi left again, but not before blowing him another kiss. Izuku had stopped paying her any attention. Izuku looked back up at the clock, trying to look at anything in the room other than his hands or the food, 9:10 a.m. But the steam from the freshly cooked sausages and rice wafted into his nostrils, enticing him to eat. Izuku's stomach grumbled loudly, and even though Izuku kept telling himself he wasn't in the mood for food, his rumbling gut forced him to turn his attention back to the breakfast spread before him. There was just one problem, though, his hands. Izuku placed his hand over the pair of chopsticks that had come with the rice bowl, grasping at it as best he could. They, too, shook whenever he tried picking them up. They clattered out of his hands and back on the tray time after time, the lack of results and progress slowly eating up Izuku's patience as he failed to grasp and pick up something as simple as a pair of chopsticks after dozens of attempts. Damn it all. Izuku angrily cursed under his breath, uncharacteristic of him as it was. Now the world was just mocking him, of that he was certain. The chopsticks dropped back onto the tray, clattering a final time as Izuku finally embraced defeat. How many minutes were spent trying to pick them up? And where was his mother? How long did it take to get to his room from the lobby? Izuku glanced back up at the clock, 9:10 a.m. What? Had the clock broken just now? What were the odds of that? I'd start with the sausages if I were you, a familiar but no less startling gentlemanly voice spoke to the left of Izuku, causing the poor boy to jolt and thrash around to see the source of the voice, knocking the tray loose from the handlebars in the process and sending the food and milk splattering to the tile below. The tray rattled around the floor before eventually coming to a halt, leaving Izuku's shocked panting as the only audible sound left in the room. He stared wide-eyed at the figure with the same colored blue tunic, red cloak, and well-trimmed face as yesterday. Dr. Strange, Izuku panted. You seem surprised to see me, Midoriya, Strange replied from his seat, the same chair he had been sitting in yesterday as well. I didn't. Izuku stammered. How long have you been there? Did you not hear me come in? Strange responded inquisitively, his eyebrow perked. I didn't even see you come in. Izuku said, feeling as exasperated as he was hungry. Interesting, said Strange, as if such a logical response was something to muse over as he looked down at the mess on the floor. I apologize for ruining your meal. Allow me to fix that. Strange placed his hands together, curling his pinkies and thumbs into his palms. His index fingers were pointing straight up while his middle and ring fingers connected with each other, forming a rhombus-like shape. Izuku watched the scene curiously. What was the doctor going to do? Strange then slid his hands past each other while maintaining the positions of his fingers. A rumbling hum caused Izuku to blink in confusion. The room rumbled. What was happening? He glanced back over to the doctor and, was he wearing that amulet yesterday? Draped from his neck was a shimmering amulet, opening like a golden eye and revealing a radiant green light from within. Strange reconnected his hands, his thumbs parallel to each other with his other fingers spread wide open. He rotated them clockwise, like a key being turned in a lock, and a resplendently emerald pattern appeared before his hands. Strange pulled one of his hands back, and the pattern was pulled along with it, coating his other arm like a bracer of slowly swirling emerald energy. Izuku could only stare on, fascinated at the intricate display before him. Strange took a step back, allowing the green radiance from the amulet to illuminate the ruined breakfast on the floor. He slowly waved his hand across the air to his right, the swirling pattern adorned on his arm, layers upon layers of squares and circles intricately placed within each other, moving in tandem with him. Izuku could hardly believe the spectacle he was witnessing. As Strange slid his hand, the fallen tray began rotating again before floating back up. The sausages and orange slices bounced off the floor a couple times and returned to their place atop the tray. The spilled rice was seemingly pulled back into the bowl, and the puddle of milk was sucked back into the now straightened and unperturbed carton. Izuku sat, dumbfounded and blinking, at the fully restored breakfast tray before him, still fresh and steaming, as if it were none the wiser of its plummet to the floor. Breakfast, Strange said while dispelling the green energy, the amulet closing shut tightly as well. Is served. Izuku didn't immediately respond. He sat still, looking up at Strange in awe for what had to have been several minutes, though the clock still read 9:10 a.m. Dr. Strange, Izuku finally managed to speak, a hint of excitement in his voice. I've never seen a quirk like that before. Strange bowed as if he had given an elaborately staged performance which, of course, it was, and the performance had only just begun. You flatter me, young man, Strange said with thinly veiled amusement. Though I must inform you that what you just saw was not caused by any quirk. What? Was all Izuku could utter before Dr. Strange began levitating cross-legged above the end of his bed. Your quirk is levitation. Izuku said with a slack-jawed expression. Strange shook his head. Not levitation, no. Strange flicked his index and middle fingers up, a chunk of the rice floating out of the bowl and toward Midoriya's mouth. The boy winced as he was suddenly reminded of the deplorable state of his hands, preventing him from eating without assistance. Telekinesis, then? Izuku asked with a little less enthusiasm. Wrong again, Strange said with an unreadable tone and